Brothers and sisters, I am often asked, what is hell according to the Bible, and what is the truth about it? The biblical narrative uses several distinct terms to describe the state of existence after death and the final judgment. The earliest accounts refer to a silent realm where all the deceased go, regardless of their moral standing. This place is described as a land of shadows and forgetfulness, located beneath the surface of the earth. Later, Greek-influenced texts introduce a concept of a temporary holding place for souls awaiting a final verdict. The most vivid descriptions of a fiery destination involve a term derived from a physical location near Jerusalem used for burning refuse. This physical imagery serves to illustrate a spiritual reality involving the total consumption of what is unholy. The Bible defines this state primarily as a permanent separation from the presence and glory of the Creator. It is characterized as the outer darkness, which signifies the complete absence of divine light and order. This destination was originally prepared for spiritual entities who led a rebellion in the celestial realms. Humanity enters this state when they align themselves with that same spirit of autonomy and rejection of divine authority. The essence of this existence is the preservation of a person's choice to live independently of their source. It is presented as a fixed condition that remains unchanged once the transition from physical life is complete. The descriptions of suffering are often interpreted as the internal result of a soul realizing its eternal loss. Let us consider the historical context of these terms. The biblical terminology for the afterlife is composed of several distinct Hebrew and Greek words that carry specific meanings. Sheol is the Hebrew term used to describe the collective grave or the underworld where all human activity ceases. Hades serves as the Greek equivalent in the New Testament, representing a temporary state for the soul before the final day of reckoning. Gehenna is a geographically specific term referring to the Valley of Hinnom, a place associated with historical trauma and perpetual fire. This site functioned as a public dump, where fire was used to purify the city by consuming everything that was rejected or unclean. The use of Gehenna in teaching illustrates the concept of being permanently cast out from the communal life of the faithful. Tartarus appears in the Greek texts to describe a deep abyss reserved specifically for non-human, rebellious entities. The lake of fire is presented as the final destination that appears only after the current earthly history is concluded and judgment is passed. This location is distinct from the grave because it involves the total destruction of death itself and the removal of corruption from the cosmos. Fire, in this context, serves as a metaphor for divine purity, encountering that which cannot be reconciled with holiness. Darkness represents the opposite experience, focusing on the isolation of the individual from the source of all warmth and light. These metaphors work together to describe a reality that transcends human language and physical dimensions. The transition from physical death to these various states follows a specific judicial sequence according to the biblical record. Each term contributes a different layer to the understanding of what it means to be excluded from the divine order. It is also important to look at the nature of the suffering described in these accounts. The scriptural concept of fire is frequently used as a metaphor for the absolute purity of the divine presence. When a soul that has rejected holiness encounters this purity, the experience is described in terms of heat and consumption. The term second death signifies a total and final separation from the source of all life and existence. Unlike the first death, which is biological, this state involves the removal of the spiritual grace that supports consciousness. The imagery of weeping and gnashing of teeth highlights the cognitive dissonance and profound self-reproach experienced by the individual. It illustrates a state where the will remains defiant, but the power to act on that defiance is completely stripped away. The worm that dies not symbolizes the internal corruption of a mind left alone with its own unresolved choices and memories. This internal decay mirrors the physical decomposition of organic matter when it is no longer inhabited by life. The Bible presents this condition as one of total deprivation, where every good gift associated with the Creator is permanently withdrawn. This includes the withdrawal of order, purpose, and the capacity for interpersonal connection. The outer darkness is the logical conclusion of a life lived in shadow, away from the light of truth and revelation. It is a realm where the self is the only remaining reality, leading to a profound and eternal state of loneliness. The lack of divine restraint allows the inherent consequences of one's character to reach their full and final maturity. This maturation of a rebellious nature produces an environment of constant friction and psychological distress. The biblical narrative suggests that this outcome is a fixed reality established to preserve the purity of the new creation. The finality of this state is rooted in the biblical principle that the human soul is an indestructible entity. Because the soul cannot be annihilated, it must occupy a space either within or outside the divine kingdom. This space is defined by the complete absence of the common grace that currently sustains all people during their earthly lives. The removal of this grace results in a total loss of the ability to experience satisfaction or rest. The concept of divine justice provides the framework for understanding why such a realm exists. The biblical framework for justice necessitates a realm where the consequences of moral choices are fully realized. Justice is defined as the alignment of the cosmos with the objective character and laws of its creator. A moral universe requires a system of accountability where every action is weighed against an absolute standard of holiness. If no ultimate distinction existed between those who follow divine order and those who defy it, justice would be an empty concept. The existence of hell serves as a formal confirmation of the high value placed on human agency and decision-making. The Bible presents a final judgment where every hidden intent and public act is evaluated with perfect transparency. This judgment is not an impulsive reaction, but the logical result of an individual's cumulative life direction. A person who consistently cultivates a nature that is incompatible with divine purity cannot survive in a realm defined by that purity. The separation described in the texts is the honoring of a soul's persistent desire to remain autonomous and independent. The divine authority does not force a relationship upon those who have spent their lives avoiding such a connection. Hell is the destination for those who have chosen a reality where the Creator is not the central point of reference. The magnitude of the consequence is tied to the infinite nature of the authority that has been rejected. Because the source of life and goodness is eternal, the deliberate rejection of that source carries an eternal weight. This realm preserves the integrity of the heavenly state by ensuring that rebellion and corruption are never allowed to return. The boundaries of this destination are fixed to protect the peace and order of the new creation from further disruption. Divine justice ensures that the cries of the oppressed are answered by holding every oppressor to a final account. In this sense, the existence of a place of punishment is the guarantee that evil will not have the final word in history. The wrath described in the Scriptures is the settled, holy opposition of light toward darkness. This leads to the question of what specific roles the will and the conscience play in this outcome. Human volition is presented as a fundamental pillar of the biblical understanding of the afterlife. The capacity to choose implies that those choices must have an eventual destination and a permanent weight. The conscience functions as an internal witness that records the alignment or misalignment of a person's life with moral law. In the final state, this conscience is fully awakened and can no longer be suppressed or distracted by earthly activities. This means that the internal realization of one's own moral failings becomes a source of significant mental and spiritual distress. The Bible describes a process where the human heart can become progressively hardened against the influence of light and truth. When a person repeatedly chooses self-interest over divine directives, they are essentially sculpting their own eternal character. Hell is the environment where that character is allowed to exist without the external constraints of social norms or divine intervention. The suffering mentioned in the texts is often linked to the memory of opportunities that were knowingly rejected. Regret becomes a permanent companion when the soul realizes that its isolation was self-authored through a series of deliberate acts. The individual's will is respected to the extent that they are permitted to keep the independence they sought during their physical life. However, this independence turns into a prison when it is stripped of the resources and life-giving energy found only in the Creator. There is no recorded change of mind in this state, because the will has reached its final, unchangeable configuration. This psychological reality ensures that the punishment is not an arbitrary external addition, but an organic outcome of the soul's own path. The conscience, once a guide, becomes a mirror that reflects the reality of the self in stark and unavoidable detail. Every attempt to justify one's rebellion falls away when the soul is confronted with the objective truth of its own history. Understanding the timeline of these events helps clarify the distinction between temporary states and the finality of the judgment. The biblical chronology distinguishes between the immediate state after death and the final disposition of all souls. Upon physical death, the conscious part of a human enters a temporary intermediate realm known as Hades. This intermediate state is not the final location of punishment, but a period of waiting for the universal resurrection. The Bible describes a future event where all who have died will be restored to physical bodily life. This resurrection ensures that the whole person, both body and spirit, participates in the final evaluation. There is a specific judicial event described as a great throne where the records of every human life are opened. These records represent the objective truth of an individual's deeds, thoughts, and motives during their earthly tenure. The outcome of this trial determines the transition from the intermediate state to the final state of existence. It is only after this formal legal proceeding that the lake of fire or Gehenna becomes the actual destination. Death and the intermediate realm itself are described as being cast into this final place of consumption. This signifies the end of the current cosmic order and the beginning of an eternal separation between life and death. The finality of this judgment is based on the fact that every possible evidence has been presented and weighed. No further appeals or changes in status are mentioned in the text once this decree is issued. The transition from time to eternity makes the concept of a second chance logically impossible within this framework. This sequence ensures that the final destination is not reached in haste but through a deliberate and transparent process. The structural integrity of this timeline highlights the precision with which the biblical authors viewed divine law. The nature of the body in this state is a subject that clarifies much about the intensity of the experience. The resurrection of the dead involves the restoration of physical form to every individual before the final judgment. This physical restoration is not a return to mortal life, but an entry into an existence within an eternal dimension. The biblical narrative indicates that the resurrected body is specifically configured to endure the environment to which it is assigned. For those entering the realm of separation, the body becomes a permanent vessel for the realization of spiritual consequences. Physical sensations are heightened to correspond with the gravity of the soul's internal moral condition. This resurrected body is described as incorruptible, meaning it does not decay or cease to function, despite the presence of destructive elements. The imagery of fire and darkness interacts with this physical form in a way that produces constant sensory and psychological distress. Because biological death is no longer possible in this state, there is no unconsciousness or cessation of experience. The body acts as a tangible manifestation of the choices and character developed during the individual's first earthly life. The integration of body and spirit ensures that the judgment is experienced by the whole person rather than an abstract consciousness. There is no physical sustenance, rest, or comfort provided for these bodies in the realm of exclusion. The senses are deprived of every element that previously provided pleasure, relief, or a sense of well-being. The durability of this new form is the foundation for the continuity of the state defined as eternal. Every physical capacity is turned toward the awareness of the complete loss of the divine source of life. This state represents the ultimate disharmony between the physical form and the environment it inhabits. The role of Jesus in the context of this judgment is perhaps the most critical aspect to examine. The historical records of the New Testament identify Jesus Christ as the primary source of detailed information regarding the reality of hell. It is a documented fact that he spoke about this destination more frequently and with more specificity than any other figure in the Scriptures. He presents himself not merely as a teacher, but as the designated judge who holds ultimate authority over the afterlife. This judicial role is portrayed as an essential function of his sovereignty over all created life and spiritual dimensions. His teachings characterize hell as a concrete, objective reality rather than a symbolic state of mind. He uses the metaphor of a separation between different categories of people to illustrate the finality of the moral divide. This separation is based on whether an individual's nature is compatible with the absolute holiness of the divine realm. The wrath of the Lamb is a scriptural term describing his settled and holy opposition to everything that remains corrupt. His judgment is described as being executed with a perfect and complete knowledge of the secrets of every human heart. He emphasizes that being cast out from his presence is the most significant and painful aspect of the final state. The shut door in his narratives represents the precise moment when the opportunity for transition or change is permanently withdrawn. He defines the environment of this exclusion as a place where the awareness of loss produces profound and unending regret. His testimony establishes that the destination was originally prepared for rebellious spiritual entities rather than for humanity. However, he clarifies that those who align their will with that rebellion will inevitably share in its final outcome. The authority of his word serves as the primary foundation for the biblical doctrine of a literal and eternal judgment. His role as the one who offers life is intrinsically linked to his role as the one who defines the boundaries of the kingdom. The specific nature of the term eternal in this context is a subject that requires a closer look at the biblical concept of time. The biblical concept of eternity is not merely a measurement of endless minutes, but signifies a state belonging to the age to come. This duration is described as being parallel to the very existence of the divine nature itself. The texts use identical Greek and Hebrew terms to define the length of both life in the kingdom and the duration of the punishment. This symmetry establishes that the destination of the rebellious is not a temporary correction but a final resolution. Time in this state operates independently of the celestial cycles of the sun, moon, and stars that govern physical life. The experience is presented as a permanent now where the possibility of future change or improvement has been removed. The Bible indicates that the judgment passed at the end of history is the final word on the status of every soul. This permanence is fundamentally tied to the fact that the human spirit has been created as an immortal entity. Because the spirit cannot be extinguished by physical means, its awareness persists indefinitely after the body's first death. The absence of an endpoint for this state is a reflection of the infinite nature of the authority that was rejected. The soul finds itself in a condition of stasis, where the character developed during life is locked into its final form. There is no scriptural record of any mechanism for transition, escape, or the annihilation of the self in this realm. The deprivation of light and life is total because the separation from the source of these things is permanent. The loss described in the narrative is absolute because it contains no hope of a different outcome in a succeeding age. One must also consider the social dynamics, or the lack thereof, in a place defined by total isolation. In the realm of separation, the biblical narrative describes a total disintegration of human connection and community. Social structures and the capacity for shared experience cease to exist, as these are divine gifts that are no longer in effect. Qualities such as love, compassion, and mutual support originate from the divine nature and are entirely withdrawn from the outer darkness. Inhabitants of this state exist in absolute individualism where the ego becomes the sole remaining center of focus. There is no provision for cooperation, mutual comfort, or any collective relief from distress. The presence of other beings is characterized not by fellowship, but as an additional source of friction and psychological discomfort. Every interaction is reduced to the collision of selfish wills that have permanently lost the capacity for compromise or kindness. Anger and resentment, left without the restraining influence of divine grace, become the primary driving forces of the soul. The term outer darkness implies a level of isolation where the perception of others is obscured by one's own internal agony. This isolation is the direct consequence of a life lived exclusively for the self, where others were viewed merely as instruments. Without the divine presence that binds creation together, existence shatters into a multitude of isolated and suffering units. The soul remains locked within its own history, endlessly revisiting past choices without the possibility of external sympathy. The complete absence of community is a fundamental component of the total deprivation defined as the second death. The silence of this state is interrupted only by the accusations of a conscience that no longer finds any earthly distractions. The absence of hope serves as the next structural element of this existence. Hope is defined in the biblical context as the confident expectation of a future positive outcome or divine intervention. The state of final separation is characterized by the absolute and permanent withdrawal of this expectation from the human experience. The scriptural narrative describes a great chasm, or a fixed gulf, that exists between the realm of the redeemed and the realm of the lost. This boundary is presented as an ontological barrier that prevents any movement, communication, or transition between the two states. The concept of time in the afterlife does not include the possibility of progress, character evolution, or eventual restoration. In the physical world, the human experience is built upon the premise that circumstances can be altered through personal effort or external grace. In the final state, this premise is replaced by the reality of a fixed and unchangeable condition that mirrors the soul's final choice. The metaphor of the shut door signifies the specific moment when the opportunity to align with the divine presence is officially withdrawn. This finality is rooted in the principle that the period for determining one's eternal orientation is strictly limited to the earthly lifespan. The realization that there is no future state beyond the current loss constitutes the primary psychological weight of the experience. Despair becomes the natural and logical result of a soul recognizing that it has achieved its ultimate desire for independence from the Creator. The absence of hope means that the internal distress of the soul finds no outlet and no promise of future relief or change. Every thought of potential escape is countered by the objective reality of a judgment that has been finalized and sealed. This lack of hope is an essential component of the judicial process, ensuring the permanent stability of the new creation's boundaries. The soul's awareness of its own indestructible nature makes the absence of a positive future an overwhelming intellectual burden. The biblical narrative offers no indication of a universalist restoration, where this hope is eventually granted to those in the outer darkness. The permanence of the condition is the direct reflection of the infinite value of the life and light that were knowingly rejected. It is necessary to consider the contrast between this state and the original purpose of human existence. The biblical account begins with the fundamental assertion that humanity was created to function as a reflection of the divine character. This original design included the capacity for logic, creativity, moral discernment, and deep interpersonal communion. The intended purpose of human existence was to act as a representative of the Creator within the physical realm and to enjoy a perpetual connection with the source of life. Hell represents the total subversion of this blueprint and the ultimate failure to fulfill this intended function. In this state of separation, the attributes that once defined the human spirit become distorted and dysfunctional. The capacity for reason remains intact, but is turned entirely inward, leading to an endless cycle of self-accusation and futile logic. The drive for creativity is replaced by a static existence where nothing new can be produced, cultivated, or enjoyed. Moral discernment persists only as the painful, constant awareness of having failed to meet a standard that is now unattainable. The inherent desire for communion is frustrated by the absolute isolation and the inability to ever again trust or experience love. The biblical narrative suggests that the dignity inherent in being a living soul makes the state of hell a profound metaphysical tragedy. If humanity were merely biological matter, the cessation of physical life would carry no spiritual weight or consequence. Because humans are created with an eternal orientation, the permanent loss of the divine connection is a catastrophic failure of their own design. This condition is described as the ultimate outcome of a vessel that has permanently lost its intended contents. The deprivation of the spiritual breath of life leaves the soul in a state of perpetual, unquenchable thirst and hunger. This void cannot be filled because the only source capable of satisfying it has been excluded by the individual's own persistent choice. The contrast between what a person was meant to be and what they have become defines the actual depth of the eternal loss. The question of why this choice remains permanent is tied to the very nature of human character and its finality. The concept of character finality suggests that there is a point at which the human will becomes permanently fixed in its chosen direction. This state of a hardened will is what prevents any genuine desire for reconciliation or change once the earthly life has ended. The biblical narrative implies that the fundamental orientation of the soul toward the divine is solidified at the moment of physical death. In the afterlife, the individual does not receive a new nature but continues to inhabit the character they cultivated throughout their earthly tenure. A will that has spent a lifetime resisting light and truth does not suddenly find the capacity to love those things simply because the consequences are now visible. True repentance is not a mere reaction to suffering, but a spiritual alignment that requires a capacity the soul has knowingly discarded. The inhabitants of the realm of separation remain as defiant in their isolation as they were during their physical existence. The suffering described in the texts does not produce a change of heart, but rather intensifies the existing resentment toward the divine order. The second death represents the final sealing of a personality that has rejected every opportunity to be transformed or restored. This internal permanence is the reason why the biblical records do not describe this destination as a place of correction or temporary purgation. Character is the cumulative result of every choice made in the face of moral truth, eventually reaching a state of total irreversibility. The soul's trajectory remains constant because the external influence of grace that prompts change is no longer active in the outer darkness. This creates a psychological state where the individual may detest their condition but continues to prefer the autonomy that caused it. The fixity of the will ensures that the final judgment is a reflection of the soul's settled and unchangeable reality. The boundaries between the realms are maintained by the internal consistency of the beings who inhabit them. This suggests that the environment of the afterlife is the ultimate mirror of the individual's inner life. it is finally necessary to summarize what these truths mean for the overall understanding of the biblical world. The biblical truth about hell is centered on the concept of eternal exclusion from the source of all life and light. It is presented not as an arbitrary torture, but as the objective conclusion of a life lived in persistent independence. The descriptions of fire and darkness serve to illustrate the total absence of divine order, comfort, and common grace. This state is characterized by the permanence of the human soul's final orientation and moral configuration. The narrative emphasizes that the transition from time to eternity renders this condition unchangeable and final. Divine justice requires a specific destination where corruption and rebellion are permanently contained and quarantined. The existence of this realm ensures that the harmony of the new creation will never be subject to further disruption. Every aspect of the scriptural record highlights the immense weight placed on human agency and individual decision-making. The distinction between the temporary intermediate state and the final lake of fire is a fundamental judicial detail. Hell is ultimately the place where the divine presence is fully withdrawn, leaving the self as the only remaining reality. This reality underscores the absolute value of the holiness and grace that define the kingdom of God. The biblical testimony remains consistent across centuries regarding the reality, the duration, and the purpose of this destination. It stands as a final confirmation of the objective moral laws that govern the entire created universe. The study of this topic concludes with the understanding that every soul eventually reaches its own chosen destination. We might now consider how this reality shapes the biblical understanding of mercy and the alternative to this separation.